Executive Committee meeting in Johannesburg. The purpose of the meeting was to equip delegates with theoretical and practical knowledge to govern better. Now, for more on this, we're now joined in studio by the new Secretary of the Liberal International, Gordon Mackay. Gordon, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Now, firstly, congratulations on your
much.
new position. What does this appointment mean for you?
Well, I think it's very significant. It's a 70-year-old organization, and it's the first African and non-European to hold the seat of Secretary General. It's hugely significant because we get to work globally on issues that matter to everyday people, around issues of good governance, addressing inequality. How do we make sure that liberal governments speak to and deliver for populations in a way that ensures that we expand their access to opportunities, expand their educational opportunities, expand their income opportunities. So it's very exciting. It's kind of taking what I do at home and expanding it and working it on a global level, but bringing an African flavor and specifically a South African perspective.
I'm actually glad you mentioned some of what the Liberal International does. In terms of issues such as good governance, addressing inequality, poverty, education issues, for example, I mean, a lot of the time we've seen organizations, NPOs, holding dialogues and discussions about this. When and how do we move beyond talk shops and actually see action being taken?
Well, I think the distinction about our organization is that we represent political parties from around the world. So, for example, our member party in Africa, one of the oldest political liberal parties in Africa, is the Democratic Alliance. And the key thing is that many of our political parties are in fact in government. We have included in our organization are the Liberals of Canada with Justin Trudeau. We have various European prime ministers. We have 2 African presidents. So obviously the ability to affect people's lives is expanded by our ability to be in government. And in that being in government, we bring a strong focus on good governance, accountable government, because that rests really at the heart of the ability for a government to provide opportunities for its people. It's being clean, it's being coherent, it's about working in the interests of people, and making sure that we develop policies that will address the significant challenges that people are facing, like unemployment, bad education systems. So for us, it's about making sure our member parties are empowered to effectively govern, and where they don't govern, to be effectively in opposition, like we are in South Africa, and to hold the government to account, to make sure that government policies govern in the interest of the majority, not in the few, and to really just hold politicians accountable for if they are elected. So at the core of what we do is a fundamental belief in freedom, expanding people's freedom, and reducing sort of the arbitrary power of the state.
Now, I mentioned earlier on that you all have wrapped up a 2-day committee meeting, and the theme is actually quite interesting: better governance, liberal answers to the 21st century challenges. Let's unpack this theme.
So I think it's significant that it's been held in Johannesburg. Obviously, South Africa, whatever political background you're from, I think will recognize that we have challenges in governance. And I think the Liberal International wanted to be clear that they believe fundamentally in South Africa, and they believe in the work of the Democratic Alliance in bringing clean governance to the South African context, recognizing that they are working with other opposition parties in the metros to clean up government and to make it more accountable. So the conference really just was about good practice sharing, like what do we in South Africa do really well where we govern? How can we share those lessons with other parties so that they can do the similar things? And how do we learn from, for example, other African parties who are doing particularly well in, say, Senegal or Ivory Coast? And how do we learn from, the Dutch who are really good in Amsterdam? So it really was just about idea sharing, and it's a good way for politicians to benchmark their performance, to get new ideas, to work together, because it's a mixture. It's like mayors and members of parliament, and so it's just it's an opportunity to share ideas about what can work, what doesn't work, what to avoid, and what kind of policies we need to implement if we're going to come up with alternative solutions to some very complex problems.
Now, in terms of demographics, the youth isn't always represented in terms of politics. How is it within the Liberal International?
All right, so the Liberal International is part of a liberal family of organizations. We have our own youth organization called IFRI, which is based globally. There's now, in the recent years, about 2 years ago, they've set up for the first time a very big African wing. So we're seeing sort of African students starting to filter through into leadership positions in this area, and it's important. I think everyone recognizes the need for a new generation, new perspectives, and I think that we as an organization foster that and welcome that. I mean, I'm only 36. I'm an incoming Secretary General of a major organization, and I bring with myself quite a fresh, diverse, different attitude, and it's been embraced and welcomed. So I think there's an inherent recognition that youth need to address some of the problems that we face, because I mean in South Africa, for example, youth unemployment is a real problem, and who better to address that than someone from the youth?
I'm actually glad that you mentioned the need for new ideas. I think a good way to wrap up would be to look at your appointment overall. You've just been appointed, but in terms of a way forward, what are your plans and what do you plan to do in the short term and obviously in the long term as well?
I think one of the big areas that we have to look at, especially as Africans, is how do we address this issue around climate change, right? So for example, 190 countries have signed the Paris Agreement, but most governments around the world and opposition parties don't really know how to respond to this piece of legislation or this accord that fundamentally has the ability to undermine economic growth in many countries. It will possibly leave some people destitute, and we've got to balance that alongside this idea of economic growth, but the need to protect our environment. And that is a very real challenge in Africa, where, for example, we're usually agricultural based, and if there's major changes in the weather, there's going to be destruction to agriculture. But at the same time, if we implement those policies badly and at the expense of people's well-being, we're going to exacerbate inequality, exacerbate poverty. So I think, for me, I think that's a particularly important issue. It's something that I want to drive, and I think it's something that we in Africa can provide thought leadership on. And so I think that will be at the center of what I'd like to do as the Secretary General.
Well, we're excited to see what the Liberal International is going to do in South Africa. Thank you so much for joining us, Gordon.
Thank you.
That was the Secretary General of Liberal International, Gordon Mackay. I'm back with more news after the break. Don't go anywhere.